Hi, everybody. It's me, Jackie Clayton with Recruiting Daily. I am so glad that you're here. I wanted to make sure that we would be remiss if we did not talk a little bit about Veterans Day. I recognize it's Veterans Day, and we want to thank everyone for their service that is here. As a side note, I know when you logged in, they said you are muted. Yes, all of you are muted, but that doesn't mean we don't want your questions. We want to make sure you can put them in the question pane, or you can tweet them out with the hashtag #RDaily. And sharing some things and awesome, we had HRTX in Chicago this past week, which is actually JoAnn's hometown, right?
Woohoo, it is.
We loved being there in Chicago. That was a success. As a side note, we are going to be next week in New York. Let me know if you have any questions. And let's just jump into it. So I met JoAnn online. She is a people expert, and we all like to call ourselves people experts in the recruiting gig, but she really is. And in case you haven't met her, I want her to introduce herself. So, JoAnn, tell the people about yourself.
Well, hello, everybody. My name, of course, is JoAnn Corley, and I'm founder and CEO of the Human Sphere, and we are a holistic talent management consultancy. And that means that we help businesses connect the human beings to the process and strategy, so they can get better business outcomes and grow their businesses more successfully, thrive in the marketplace. Because here's what we found, that leaders are great experts in their field, and yet they're not experts at leading their people. And that's what we need to, and that's our thing. And we help connect the dots.
Well, I know, and that is a problem that we're seeing industry-wide and across all industries. And I think, it reminds me of the human sphere, and we were talking about it again. We know that it's Veterans Day, and today we're focusing on hiring beyond the job description, and it really relates because that is we notice that a lot of veterans have been left behind simply because we're just looking at the job description as opposed to looking at the person as a whole.
Right.
What has been your experience with that? Like, what have you seen?
Well, you know what? It's kind of funny because I have a really broad perspective because I'm going to date myself here. I've been in, I want you to find out how old I really am. I was a recruiter almost 20 years ago. I mean, like, I know, shocking, right? And so I've been around long enough to see cycles.
Yes.
And you know what, Jackie, I have to say, the things we were talking about 20 years ago are the things we're talking about now. The only thing that's changed is technology. So what's interesting is the bad habits of recruiting back then are the bad habits being perpetuated now. And I think a lot of that is because people cycle out, and then you have new folks coming in, and they're not trained on how to recruit effectively. And so either bad habits, whoever was their mentor before, didn't train them well. But I also think that's indicative of the industry. I think we can tend to be one-dimensional in our recruiting. And depending on whether you're an in-house recruiter or an external recruiter, particularly if you're an in-house, you can kind of get tunnel vision. Because then it becomes about process, meeting goals, filling positions, and not really seeing it from a strategic perspective, or, and I find this to be very common, in-house recruiters are not really good partners with the hiring managers. And that almost hurts my heart, honestly, because that's where the partnership has got to be the strongest for the best hires to meet the strategy of the business. And, I see a lot of disconnects there.
Well, you brought something up that I want to jump to. I mean, here at Recruiting Daily, we really want to help people learn their job better, learn how to do it most effectively. And it's funny because we're having the same issues, just to back up a little bit, you said yet we're having the same issues now that we had 20 years ago, and the difference is the technology. But isn't the technology supposed to make us more effective at our job? Like, what, it's funny that you say that. And before we jump into that, I want to get your definition. Like, what's effective versus not effective as we're jumping in, so we can help people be more effective. Like, what would an effective recruiter be or look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. Ultimately, it's to find the best fit. Effective at finding the best fit within the values and scope of the company. And it's kind of like going back to the old Jim Collins things, get the right people on the bus in the right seats. And so, now where we need a more sophisticated recruiter, where before, although I thought about culture before when I was a recruiter, because I was an external recruiter, but now it's about culture. You have to also think of more intentionally about diversity. You got to be more mindful of your own bias. There's a lot more sophistication that goes into it. We know more about human behavior. 20 years ago, emotional intelligence was like this little blip on the radar. Now we have interview questions and even some protocol for screening for emotional intelligence or other, or behavior competencies. Now we have assessments where, like predictive index and other kinds of things that are pre-hire assessments we can use that are EEOC compliant that go towards behavior versus just can this person execute a job,
Well, no,
So
I just wanted to ask you, like, with that, do you think that using some of this technology, especially like behavior, because we do see a lot of people saying, oh, you need to be a cultural fit, or are you a fit for our team or our mission? Do you find that some of these assessments actually work? Do you feel like that helps us in finding the right fit, or does it add a wedge? I know there are people that are like, oh, I don't want to take assessments, or I don't want to be part of that. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think a couple of things. I think for overall they are helpful, and they're helpful for two key reasons. Number one, it does mitigate bias. That's very helpful. Number two, when you're talking about hiring beyond the job description, you want to, like, if you have a baseline or you've benchmarked what are the best behaviors or personality and more behaviors than personality, but behavior indicators that's going to make these are the most successful behaviors for this role, and you can benchmark that, and then you have an assessment that is associated with that. That's going to streamline the candidates who are going to be the better fit. One of the tools I use, it takes less than 10 minutes, and it's harmless. I mean, it's so easy it's not overwhelming, it's not threatening, and yet it's very useful in finding those key behavior indicators. So they are useful. Now, to the point about assessments too, is if you have too much protocol, recruiting protocol, it slows down the process. Then all of a sudden, and this is a big deal in our industry now, is recruiting is taking too long. So you have recruiting taking too long. You have the candidate pool shrinking because now, so now what? So we have to tweak the protocol. We still want to get the best fit. We also have to be mindful. We have other companies nipping at their toes to want to hire them, and before you know it, 2 weeks is gone, and you've talked to this person, and they've already got a job, 3 job offers.
And it's so many times I think we are trying to put the right fit, and we focus so much sometimes on fit that we forget other people are doing this in the process too, right? It's like
right.
Companies are talking to, these are people, and if you think you're the only one talking to these people, especially if they are looking for another position, you might miss them. I think recruiters forget that as soon as you talk to them, a passive candidate, and you talk to them about a job, they almost instantly become an active candidate. Like, what else is in? Let me start looking in that process, right?
Right. So I think that's where, getting really creative, we were talking before we went live about things like, social recruiting, where you have, either an online soiree or an in-person soiree. You just invite a bunch of people and just get to know people, and, where you can really get to know a bunch of people at one time, for example, and just, see how, observe them in a social atmosphere, these kinds of things. I just think we have to get super creative, and so this is interesting. It's kind of a catch-22. We want to be more effective, but we also have to release control.
Mm-hmm.
Like let go.
Okay. Do that.
Like, look at your face. Okay, yeah, it's kind of like we have to be more team-oriented in hiring to be more effective, even though ultimately we're driving that, and maybe the buck stops at our desk or at the desk of the hiring manager that we're partnering with.
Yes, and I think we forget Well, I think people are getting better, but we have so many things that you had mentioned about technology, but we get so much of the automation and so much of the tech trying to handle parts that humans used to, that we've, as a public in general, have learned the algorithm, right? So we know what to put on our resume. We know what the culture is. We can kind of, candidates are getting smarter about those things. And you can only really know a person when you actually meet them. It's
right,
different.
and get a vibe or sense of them, right? Right.
Well, now,
So two things, and two things other related to that I think is important in our discussion is, number one, for some of the companies, larger companies, they leave it to lower level admins to do initial screening. What?
right.
A. Okay. B, your system is so complex, people who are sharp and who can get a job in a hot minute don't have time and to deal with all that. So we're losing viable candidates because our system is either complex or our software just isn't up to snuff, and we're not being interviewed initially. Our first impression initially from a branding standpoint is not being made perhaps by a first face lower level person. So like they're screening. I mean, it's almost insulting, to be honest. No offense to our support admin folks, but you know what I mean. You've got a really sharp candidate, and they're expecting hopefully red carpet service even from the get-go, and they're just like almost as like the screening interview is like a waste of time. It feels like it, like you're part of the herd, not like you're a respected candidate. So.
Well, let me say, like, what do you do? So I'm a recruiter, right? So I'm mid-level. I'm beyond, I'm a senior sourcer. I'm a senior recruiter, but this is part of the process. How do I tell the hiring manager, hey, we need to get you on the phone sooner than later? And maybe they're like, oh, I want you to go through all of these different screenings. How do you introduce the conversation to them to tell them, what would you suggest on how we communicate with them so that our hiring managers understand? Because like you said, there is a disconnect between the hiring manager and recruiters that we see that's prevalent as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it's part of it is just the influence of creating the partnership, where you see, because here's the thing, it's possible that the hiring process cycle could be shortened if the partnership was tighter and the hiring manager might be involved initially. That's very possible, because they may see someone or meet someone straight away that it's like, okay, hey, this could have been candidate 1 or 2 instead of going through 20 to get to 1 or 2. So it could be, so the incentive could be, hey, let's hire quick.
Yeah.
What would that look like? Let's come up with a creative plan, because people do get stuck in their ways, stuck in their methodologies. And if you want to say, hey, I know you need this position filled quickly, let's come up with a really creative strategy on how to do just that. And let's partner in that. Let's shorten the cycle. Let's decide on some key non-negotiables, and then let's go from there. And then let's say by this date, this is going to be our goal date to have some core candidates, for either face-to-face or, group team interview or whatever else that they want to do. And I think that the partnering and trying to be creative and innovative at least excites and can provide some motivation and some openness to try something different.
We hope. That's the goal, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Well, we're talking about like beyond the job description. What do you think is lacking from the job descriptions that we have now, or what information are we like sharing effectively, and what information do we seem to be missing when we're trying to, do our pre-hire and get those people interested? What are we missing?
Well, first of all, one thing I think that a lot of recruiters don't realize is, and kind of understanding how the brain works, and I've got a really interesting story about this, is when you read a resume, you're injecting your perception of what you're reading.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read that, that is not truth. It's just your perception of what you're reading. And so just because you read it doesn't mean they've done it the way you visualized it when you read it.
That is so deep.
right? And so, it's helpful if a resume has context. Like you say, I've done this in this context. Was it a small business retail, or was it a $1 million middle market company? I mean, that context gives a lot of other peripheral information about what that person did or how that person managed, for example.
Right.
And then another thing that's interesting, and it's kind of like, in fact, I really should write a blog post about the deceptions of recruiting in our own mind. So that's the first one. We infuse our own experience into what we're reading. That's the first one. Second of all, we assume that because someone has time in a job means they've been competent in the job. Experience doesn't necessarily equal competence. They could have been a long time doing really bad, so that's possible. The other thing, particularly when you're hiring managers, is, and I found this with one of the clients that I work with, is because they've been a manager, they means that they're going to manage based on your values. So I had a company that had some carryover managers after a buyout. Well, the carryover managers were in a culture that was very abusive, disrespectful to clients. But when they were hired, the hiring manager made the perception, and the new company that they were hired into, very family values, very much trying to respect employees, giving them a voice, two completely different management styles. And yet the hiring manager of the new company sort of made the assumption, oh, they must have hired that way. They must have managed that way. So when the new manager came over and they were shocked at how they were treating people, they're like, dang, this is not, and so there's this, they weren't a culture fit. They weren't a leadership values fit. So we talk about hiring beyond the job description. We're even talking about, what does the manager in this instant, what do they value? Because people act out of their own values, not ours. And the biggest challenge in managing is trying to manage people by your values, not by theirs. And so when you want to hire people who have similar values, so there's not this huge management gap that you have to work through to have people be motivated by, similar or aligned values. So, what do they value? Do they value getting along? Do they value managing conflict? Do they value respect? Do they value, treating colleagues respectfully? And how have they demonstrated that? So, it's the core of who they are, along with their experience in the past. Is that going to be enough to be successful in this role? And that's really, one of the components of hiring beyond the job description.
You triggered something for me too, because a lot of times you have your company values, and you have your company fit, what they like to think that they are. And then you have the reality, and then you have like sub pockets. Right. An example, I used to create a different career page just for IT jobs because the culture within IT was different than the whole entire company. And so with, the people hugging and laughing on the page and skipping through the woods was not attractive to the IT.
They're like, holy crap, I don't want to do that.
They're like, I want to be part of them.
Yeah, that's very funny and very true. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's part of it too. Is and then one final piece is we're talking about going beyond the job description values is and that is fit, and we have the dilemma of wanting to find the best fit but not being homogenous. That you want diversity while having a fit. And I don't think, Jackye, we have really looked at what that looks like.
That's right.
Because I think we have a very one-dimensional view or perception of what's a fit. If they act a certain way, if they talk a certain way, they can be a great fit and be very different.
That's right.
From a diversity standpoint. So I think we as recruiters need to define what is the best fit. What does that look like? We have our behavior competencies, but what else is there involved so that we're not eliminating people and we don't have all like thinkers. We don't want to get into groupthink. We want diversity. And then what does that look like for example, if you have a recruiting referral system with current employees. That, you know what? That's awesome. Okay. Yet we still want diversity.
Right.
So, you know, it is, I think it's redefining what's successful, redefining what we want, redefining what works. That's actually part of business strategy too. And then partnering with the hiring managers on what does that look like and guiding them as the internal consultant to be able to shape that. However, I'm not sure that a lot of us as recruiters are sophisticated in that, you know, and that's where we as a community need to help each other out more with that.
Well, there was a time when the recruiters used to just find people and and get them jobs, right? There was a time when we did just, you know, headhunters. We would go into companies, find the exact same person, same job title with a competitor, pull them out, and that was our whole job, was finding
That's
people.
it.
Or LinkedIn. This is
Yep.
when you have jobs in the newspaper. And now there's so much more expected. And I don't know, you know, you were talking about the bad habits that we get into. There are recruiters that are based on the same metrics from 20 years ago as it is now. And we're looking at candidate experience. We're looking at employee experience. We're looking at candidate engagement. We're looking at all of those things, and there's some metrics that we're missing that does bring some of that human aspect. Where are these people that we hire a year later? Did we present the job?
Right. And so, yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I think that that's an important piece. So it makes me think of two things. Number one is we cannot escape, you know, data and analytics and predictive analytics and AI and where that's going in our field. You know, it's going to make our jobs a lot easier. You know, I'm an IBM futurist, and I had the opportunity to go to an event a couple of years ago where we did some brainstorming on what it's going to look like when Watson is much more engaged in analytics. So we coined the phrase the HR whisperer, because someone still has to look at the data. Someone still has to say, let's connect this data to our context and see what's going on. But certainly, you know, with Watson and predictive and cognitive computing, you know, it's going to ask you things and say, hey, you got the best candidates from over here, this place, this is where you can now spend your money. Or, you know, or when a candidate is first hired, if they had a mentor, they're going to be way more successful than if they didn't. If a candidate has to commute more than 20 miles away, there's less success. I mean, all those things came up in reports when you had Watson involved. So, you know, part of that too is maybe all these things we're talking about, Jackye, will be somewhat, I guess the question is, will they be somewhat irrelevant the more, you know, AI gets involved in recruiting? And then that makes me think of also too, are we now overcomplicating things?
Right.
You know, I'll read online where you have a CEO or someone to say, I hire purely on gut, and that's it.
Right. And they rehire on gut. And they backfill on gut. And you just start that cycle. We brought up I was at Digital Disruption. One of the things that they were talking about was they had the algorithm, they were using the software that talked about AI like you had just mentioned and bubble up, but people would say, I want to hire on gut. And they found out that 98% of the people that hired by gut and went against what the algorithm said later left the job or were fired within the first year.
Really? Whoa. Okay,
yes.
Well, that says a lot then.
I mean, we don't like to admit some of the stuff is going well. I mean, there are pieces of it that we're just not ready. You know, we're not ready. I did want to ask a question. Alan said diversity. What side of the discussion do you fall? Like, cast the widest net possible, look for the best candidate no matter where or who they are, or go straight at diversity groups? So what do you recommend when you're talking about diversity candidates? Like, where do you fall on that?
Yeah, I think it depends on the role, because I think, like, for example, if you have it really depends on the role. So, for example, let's say you have an executive level position, and there's not a lot of diversity, either women or minorities, in either a senior level C-level level, or even middle manager, then I think it's going to be more intentional. Like I could go to even a recruiting firm that specializes in that. Or I'm going to, because I think it's a level of intention based on the outcomes that you want. You know, when you went to a lower level position, it may be widest net.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then to see, you want the breadth of candidates, you want your recruiting information to be as broad as possible so it doesn't eliminate people. And then you want to be able to, you know, just bring in everybody and see who the best candidates are with everybody. And speaking of which, on this very point, one other piece I gotta say is, you know, I read online where there was a company that was starting to mask the names of candidates as a way of mitigating bias. And then they would just bring in, and then they'd have a team of people that would just read the resume without the name.
Right.
And I think those kinds of creative things are also very useful in the spirit of diversity. So again, you know, to answer the question, I think it depends on the role, and then the level of intention and attention to the outcomes that you want.
Well, and it's also important, and I noticed this back when I focused on diversity recruiting, is that people aren't asking why they want a diverse candidate. There are some teams that are important. Like, you don't, the big joke internally here at Recruiting Daily is that my audience, when we did the demographics of everything, were white males between the ages of like 26 and 35. So it's like,
really?
Yeah, swear. I swear. Because
wait, but most majority of people in recruiting and HR are women.
I know.
What?
So then the question became, okay, if you wanted a diverse candidate, if you decided you were going to go out for an African American woman and you wanted to put them on their team to be diverse, and then you ended up with somebody like me that seemingly through writing or whatever attracts white males in this younger age group, are you fulfilling your diversity needs?
Okay, so now you're talking about diversity in appearance versus diversity in culture.
Yes. That's what a lot of people first start out. When you tell them diversity, they say, oh, women and people of color. They don't look at diversity of thought.
Yeah. Yeah, or diversity of like even diversity of where you grew up. I mean, you know, I grew up in Chicago. You know, just to have from no offense, but someone from the South would be diverse. I mean, you know, because you know, we even, you know, I've had the chance to travel all over the U.S. Every region is different. Yes. I mean, in fact, I ended up coaching an engineer, female engineer that worked in Colorado, who was from New York and formerly a lawyer. And nobody on her team liked her. You know why? Because she was too assertive and too aggressive.
Right.
Now, that's technically diversity, meaning region, woman, tech field. So in the coaching, she just had to build awareness around, you know, what was offensive and how she could relate to her colleagues better, and, you know, and it ended up being a successful engagement. But I think that's an important discussion, is what is diverse to you, and what are we looking for, what will we allow? Because I think, again, we're very, you know, like very superficial in how we see diversity.
And sometimes people just aren't ready. They're just not ready for a diverse candidate.
They aren't.
I remember I moved from Miami to Portland, Oregon, and I was a recruiting manager in Portland, and they were telling me about all these hires, and they said, Jackye, you look like you want to say something. And I said, I just don't understand why we're having a meeting about this instead of recruiting on it if it's so important. And everybody just looked at me like I just offended everybody in the room. I wasn't trying to, but that was just bringing that Miami culture over to Portland. You know, it was a difficult thing. Right. And those things weren't. I will tell you something that's important for everyone to know really quick, and we only have a little bit, but you brought something up when you're talking about being diverse, north, south, and some of those things. Textio, and they're not a sponsor here or whatever, but it's important to let people know, there is a tool called Textio that actually will change your job description as you write it based on the location of your job, and based on you're having words that are offensive. So if you're hiring in New York and you live in California, there's been studies that if you say, oh, it's an awesome job, you'll turn somebody off from other regions, maybe in New York.
Yeah,
Where
it'll trigger a bias of Valley Girl or something.
right, and so it'll change it for you and say, you don't want to use those words there. So there are some technology that's helping, actually does help us connect instead of divide us, in an effort. At least it's a good place to start so that you can look diversely at different situations and realize that, you know, it educates the recruiter as well to you know, it kind of triggers them with some of the unconscious bias that they might not even know they have.
Right. So let me also put in a plug for quote unquote older workers. I've seen a couple of posts in LinkedIn lately about you know, so almost a resurgence of hiring seniors. I'm like so shocked I'm using these words, you know, because I'm in that category.
Right.
But I think that is one of the most one of the hardest things to deal with is not hiring folks past their 50s. I mean, I just think it's ridiculous because they can be the best workers, the most experienced in positive ways. This whole adage about I don't want to undo habits that other, you know, how about character? How about, you know, there's so many other things that they can bring to the table. I think we've, you know, recruiters have collectively poo-pooed and had this cutoff, and I just kind of want to put a plug in, so we're talking about diversity, about really rethinking that.
Yep.
You know, and being more holistic in a hiring and being aware of even that kind of prejudice or bias.
You know, that's awesome. And then with that, look, it's 12:32 already. I know I could talk to you. I know. I could talk to you all day. And I know you'll be back because there's so much more that we didn't go over for those things. But any last words before we shut off?
Yes, my big thing is this. Hiring beyond the job description also means having your team prepared to receive people once you hire them. Why go through all that work and all that money and then have crappy managers? Can I get an amen?
Amen.
Because honestly, that is the holistic recruiting as part of the bigger picture. It is the beginning of the life cycle of an employee that you hopefully they'll stay a while and be happy. But having really solid managers makes all the difference in making our initial efforts as recruiters pay off long term.
I appreciate that so much. That's great, JoAnn. You are so smart. I knew you were so smart. And it's everybody who's tuning in. We are recording this. It will be available. You'll see it up on our site, but you can also see it on Recruiting Blogs. If you go to YouTube, go ahead and subscribe when you're there. And if you like what we're doing there, hit the thumbs up button. We'd appreciate it. We like it, and JoAnn like it. That being said,
liking is caring and sharing.
Caring, that's absolutely right. You are so right. Alan, thank you for your questions. Thank you for being here. And I would love everybody to join us next week. And JoAnn, again, thank you so much. I appreciate you so much.
Oh, thanks for the invitation, Jackye.
You're welcome. I will talk to you soon. Tell all my friends in Atlanta hi. Bye.